Right, carrying on with knight versus rook, and in particular a lone knight versus a lone rook. That might be a bit confusing at first because we can see that both sides have a pawn on the board. I've already done a video of lone knight versus lone rook. I went through various positions. I went through a couple of positions from the 9th century in a game that predates chess. I went through some grandmaster games where mistakes were made in trying to defend knight versus rook. And I played a couple of games against Stockfish from those positions, trying to have a go at it. And it wasn't convincing, but I did actually do it. Now, I think it's very hard. I don't agree with Dvoretsky that it's just a simple sort of, knight versus rook's a relatively simple draw. You've just got to be careful of keep your knight out the corner and don't let your knight get separated from the king. That's all very well, but if you're already a little bit in the corner, then I just think it's hard. And we saw in the two Grandmaster games that I went through that mistakes were made by some, extremely strong players, and I don't think that's surprising. So why have we got a position where both sides have got their pawn on the board? Well, the point is that, and you get this with all the endgame work, like I've seen it in all the endgame work I've been going through, you get like this layering of knowledge. Once you know rook and pawn versus king, for example, then you take that knowledge with you into rook and two pawns versus rook and one pawn, because you could always end up transposing into that. And it's the same here. Like, we know that knight versus rook is a draw, provided that the side defending it with the knight doesn't get their knight stuck in the corner and doesn't let their knight get separated from the king. So if white can find a way to basically swap those pawns, but the knight's already separated from the king, or already in a sort of very disadvantageous position in the corner, then white wins. And that's exactly what the player with the white pieces did in this 1998 game. Because it doesn't look good, like as in, it looks, when I say it doesn't look good, it doesn't look like there's a way for white to progress. The knight's guarding the f6 square. We want to get the white king closer to the black king, where we could then start thinking about checkmating threats being a real problem for black. But we can't get into the square. And if we leave the defence of the f4 pawn, the black knight just takes it. But the player with the white pieces says, okay, fine, you have the pawn. I'm going to come and get your g6 pawn, and then your knights become separated from your king. And in the game, knight takes f4 check was played, king f6, and I'll come back to that in a minute. But the player with the black pieces was also an extremely strong player, and they would have known, well, okay, I can see what white's doing there, I'm going to get my knight separated from the king. So what if they instead sort of decided to move their king? Just saying, well, I'm not moving this knight, I'm going to stop your king coming into f6, and I'll play king f8. White's got a lovely little trick here, if you like. Rook f7 check. And if black plays king e8, then we just come after the g-pawn. Okay, so I guess this is the second time in this position that white would have used to their advantage that they don't mind sort of losing a minor battle, in this case the exchange, for the fact they're still going to be transposing into a winning version of something else. In this case it would be a winning king and pawn ending. The first thing they did was sacrifice their pawn, knowing that we can swap pawns, I'll get into a winning version of lone rook versus lone knight. And in that particular variation, they don't mind sacking the exchange as well. If instead black played king g8, then we just follow the black king in. This is all focused on eventually sort of trying to force the black knight to move, and then go after the g6 pawn. So yeah, we still don't want the white king coming into f6, so black plays their only one legal king move, but then the white king comes into f8, and the black knight has to move, and we go after the g pawn, and it's over. So I guess the player with the black pieces saw all of that and just said, okay, I'll have the pawn. Knight takes f4 check, and I'll just try and get the knight back to the king and get a drawn version of knight versus rook. It is gone. I mean, the engine's saying checkmate in 32. The king came into f6, and then the black knight went even further away from the black king, so it just got separated. And now I'll go through how the game ended. White nabbed the pawn, knight back to f4 check, king g5, knight e6, king f6, knight went to f8, rook d8, and black resigned. like the effort to try and get the knight back to the king meant it was a knight in the corner, and yeah, I mean, you can see that that knight is now getting lost. So why did they move their knight even further away here from g2, especially as it's defending the g pawn? Why didn't they just move their king? Well, king f8 is obviously useless. It walks into a mate in 1. But what about king h8? Well, if that had been played, then the rook can come back and attack the knight, and the knight's just sort of running out of squares. If the knight moves, we're going to grab the g pawn, except for knight e2. Obviously, we'll play rook d8. Should we probably play rook? What would we play there? Say play rook. Oh, we can play rook h4 check as well, couldn't we? I mean, there's all sorts of moves. We can just hit the knight as well. But what if black defends with g5? Because that pawn can't be taken, obviously, because knight e6 would be a draw. Well, now white can come back, rook d7. If the knight moves, then we're going to grab the g pawn. And the knight's in the corner. This is just, yeah, big trouble. The knight's become separated from the king. But back in this position, after... where was it? Oh yes, after rook d7, instead of moving the knight, just push the g pawn. And if the g pawn gets pushed, white can come back, rook d4, and once again it's gone. So yeah, that was a game from 1998. The player with the white pieces used to their advantage that an exchange of pawns in this position is fine as long as it's an exchange into a place where the knight's become separated from the king or the knight's stuck in the corner. Yeah, and white won that fairly quickly. But you can also have situations where that's always on the horizon. But here's a position from a 1924 game, and it's actually possible for white to defend this, even though they're a pawn down. So they're the exchange and a pawn down. And the problem black's got is that to progress, they need to get their king in to help. Because this rook's stuck defending the b3 pawn, and as long as the white king's in contact with it, we've got to be careful how we say this, you know, it can't move away, otherwise the white king just nabs it. But lurking in the background of this position the entire time is, you know, the player with the white pieces needs to be careful. It's like, you can't just win that pawn and then it's a draw. It's not as simple as that, because you might win that pawn in unfavourable circumstances where your knight's in the corner. I mean, it could be a trivial, you win that pawn and then immediately your knight gets pinned to your king. But, you know, the point is you can't just bank on winning that pawn, meaning it's an automatic draw, and we'll see that in a couple of variations. But this is a drawn position if white's just careful about how they stop the black king getting in to help. So yeah, we'll go through it. So knight a4 was played in the game. Rook e3, knight back to b2, and the black king, the plan is to come round the back of the rook and get in to help this way. You've got to keep the rook in defence of that b3 pawn. I will see in a different position in a minute, actually, that, I mean, there's no point for white just sort of moving this knight in a particular place and trying to round up the b3 pawn, because the rook's already protecting this third rank. So as soon as the knight's not protecting b2, which it has to if it wants to attack b3, that pawn will just go. Knight back to a4, and here we go with the king journey, king f3. Okay. White's only got one drawing move here, which is king a3. Okay. I'll go through why knight b2 loses in a sec. I think this is the moves that actually happened in the game. So white played king a3, and a couple of choices for black here. If they carry on with their plan of king e2, then we can just round up the b pawn. Okay, so the plan for white was that all the time their king was on b4, I said you can't move the knight to attack the b pawn because the black rook's defending the third rank. But if you stick your king on a3, this b pawn can no longer go because we're guarding the b2 square. So that, I guess that was white's plan, put the king on a3 and then come and round up the b pawn. But here we have to be careful again. Although it's a sort of trivial have to be careful. black would play king d2, and now knight b3, knight taking the pawn, would actually throw away the game, because the knight is immediately pinned to the king. So yeah, I mean, knight takes b3, king c2, and white resigns. But white just draws with a simple king b2. There's no way that black can defend that pawn, and the knight and the king are not close enough to the corner. And we could view the board in this sort of way, with this being the back rank, and we're not on the back rank. I mean, it's uncomfortable, but it is then a draw. But black didn't have to sort of carry on with their plan when they'd done the plan. They put their rook on e3 and then they moved the king this way around. They have actually got a sneaky comeback to e4 here, which is what was played in the game. And this is the bit where if white carries on with their same plan, they will lose it. So knight c5 check this time has actually thrown away the draw, because this time king d4 attacks the knight and it's got to move. It can't take the pawn because that knight's then pinned to the king. But white saw that in the game and just played king back to b4. Okay. We saw king d4, and then we get back to the knight b2, rook h3, knight a4, king d3, and then white took on b3, king d4 check, and they agreed a draw there. But if we go back to the original position, where, I mean, white's just going to move their knight back and forth, and if black goes the long way around with the king, then as soon as he does that, white's got to put their king on a3, okay, as we've seen. But what happens if white just carries on with knight b2? Well, this time the black king does come round, and it's going to get to the defence of the pawn. There's a couple of nice lines here. I particularly like this one. If now white goes king a3, thinking, well, I'm guarding these two squares directly with my knight, and I'm guarding this square indirectly because of this knight fork. Black's like, oh yeah, let's see. How about that for a nice finish? It's gone. So yeah, I particularly enjoyed that line. But what if white sees that and instead plays knight c4 first? Rook has to move this time, and then go king a3. So just changing the move order of what just happened. Well, here black can play rook c3, and I mean, where's that knight going to go? If it goes to a5, king d3, king b2, rook back to c5, and this is an example of what I was talking about. It's like, okay, we've won that pawn, but you're in big trouble here. Well, where's the king going? It has to stay in contact. King c3, it's gone. Or if the knight goes to d6, then we're back to like, all right, the pawn might go, but we're in knight's got separated from the king. So we don't mind if the b3 pawn goes. Or knight e5, same idea. We just forget about the b pawn and come after the white knight because it's got separated from the king. So yeah, very, very interesting position that, where the side with the knight, even though they're in exchange and a pawn down, can defend, but they've got to be careful not to just go and grab this b pawn under any circumstances. It's all about stopping the black king getting in, and the trick is, as soon as the black king makes its journey round the rook, then you put your king on a3, and you're just going to come and win this pawn. So if black carries on with king e2, you've won the pawn. And if black changes their mind because they see a little tactic, great, you just come back. There's just no way for black to make progress. So that's quite nice. And last but not least, this one looks like it's been set up as a puzzle. This is actually from a 1938 game. It's only relevant to lone rook versus lone knight in some of the variations, and it's in the Dvoretsky endgame manual. And I think one of the reasons he puts it in, because he says it's a very good position for exploring the sorts of positions where a lone knight can defend against a rook and a pawn. So it's only a slight extension of lone rook versus lone knight. It's white to play. White has 2 winning moves, though one of them is really just not throwing away the win. You would have to repeat and go back to this position to then play the winning move. The winning move was played in the game, but not with the correct follow-up. So you could pause the video here if you wanted to and try and work out what should white do to win this game. And like I say, in the game, the winning move was played. I'm going to come back to the original position and go through some different moves and explore, as Dvoretsky recommends, where a rook and a pawn isn't good enough to beat the lone knight. But g6 wins. Okay. In the game, knight takes g6 was played. And then in the game, the player with the white pieces then went wrong. And it's quite elegant to see how black defends here. So rook g5 was played. Knight f4. Rook to g8. And then black just plays knight e6. They're just going to... I mean, they've got a very simple plan, which is king here. Ooh, turn the knight into a king. And then win the g-pawn. And what can white do against this? If they push the g-pawn, the black king just sort of follows it up the board. If they attack the knight comes back to f4. So this is how the game ended, in a perpetual like that. But back in this position, white shouldn't have played rook g5. White should have played rook h6. Knight comes to e5, push the g-pawn. Knight f7. And here we should play rook h5. If we play rook g6, then the pawn's getting lost, okay, and that's just a draw. But rook h5. I mean, a couple of choices here for black. If knight e5, then we can still push the g-pawn. Can't be taken because of rook g5 check. And if the king comes in and attacks the rook, we ignore it and play g6. So that would win the game for white. The winning line is g6, and when the knight takes, we play rook h6, and then push the pawn. Okay. But back in this original position, what if... let's go to this rook h6 first of all, which is quite clever, because if it is still winning, black's best try is knight f7, where to win it, white has to return to the original position. They have to play rook h5 and knight e5, and then we get back to the original position. But what if white did something else here and sort of went for a different plan where they're just going to lose one of those 2 pawns but keep the other one? I mean, it's still rook and pawn versus knight. You'd think that would be enough for a win. So rook a6, knight takes g5, and then we come back and defend the g-pawn. This is now incredibly similar to that other position from the 1924 game, that last game I was looking at. We've got a similar sort of thing going on. Like, white's defending this g-pawn, which means that... And they're also covering the entire fourth rank. The only way that white can win this g-pawn... that black, can win this g-pawn, is to attack it with their knight. But as soon as this knight's attacking g4, it can't also be defending g5. So you imagine the black knight comes to e5, for example, somehow. We just push the g-pawn, and then it's just over. The black king is cut off from, just cut off from the fourth rank. The pawn can just sort of stay there. I mean, the knight can guard its next push, but then you can just get your king in, even if it has to make it sort of long way around the board over here. It will get to the pawn. So black can't attack that g-pawn with their knight because it just gets pushed. Unless the black king is on h4. If the black king's on h4, then it's guarding the g5 square. Okay. White can't get their king in to help because as soon as it crosses the fourth rank, it's going to interfere and get in the way of the defense of the g-pawn, where the g-pawn can just get taken. So white's only way to progress is to get their rook out the way and try and get their king round the back of it. And black's got to respond to that. That is a winning plan. But they've got plenty of time to do it, because once the king sort of goes over here and gets around the back of the rook to come in, then black can stick their king on h4 and manoeuvre the knight round to pick up the g-pawn. Everyone clear on all of that? So, yeah, in this position here, I mean, let's look at various moves that that black can play. Let's just do the knight f3 line first of all. So knight f3, rook b4, black comes to round up the pawn. That's just gone. Okay. All right, we can leave our knight on e5, stopping the pawn going any further. But white's plan is very, very simple. That king can't get past the fourth rank. You can't block with a knight. We just take it and then push the g-pawn. And the king's coming around the back. I mean, we have to be careful of various knight forks and stuff, but just come around. In fact, if you stay on white squares, I think, isn't it fine? You don't have to be careful of knight forks, but yeah, it's one. So yeah, black can't do that. The only way they can do that is to put their king on h4. It's a bad idea to do that straight away. Okay. This still is okay for black, but they now have to move their king back. Any knight move here loses. King h3 apparently is still okay. King g3 looks the most sensible to me. Okay, so black doesn't need to be in a hurry to round up that g-pawn though. They can just sort of do nothing and say to white, well, you can't make progress. Your rook's got to carry on defending the g-pawn. You can't get your king past your rook. The only way you can progress here is to get your king past your rook, because I'm not going to let you get your king close this way. So just put my king on f3, and if needs be, I can move my knight back and forth. There'll always be a free square. This rook can't guard all of these squares at the same time, so we can just leave the king on f3. And how's the white king going to get in? Well, white might think I'll go king c2, and there you go, knight move, king c3, knight back. The only plan that white's got is to shift the rook and then bring the king round the back. Okay, so rook c4, king g3. Again, if the white king comes over this way, the black king can come back and just say, no, you're not coming in that way. So this is the only plan. But as soon as white does that, black needs to get on with defending against it. Cover the g5 square with king h4, king c5, and now go after the g-pawn. Okay, king e5. Just be careful not to throw away the draw at the last minute. It's a fairly obvious why knight takes g4 loses, but that's exactly the same as the previous position. King g5. The pawn's going. It's a draw. It's a drawn version of knight versus rook. So what else? What if white tries rook h1 and just gives up the g4 pawn? Okay, rook g1 check. We're now defending the pawn from behind. Now get the king in. Knight to g6, king e3, move the knight. Again, the white rook has to stay on defense of the g-pawn. Okay, so the black king can basically just stay on f5, and we can just move the knight back and forth. The only way that white's going to make progress is to get their king in somehow. Rook g3, knight g6, and then here we go, trying to get the king in somehow. Knight to f4, king c4, because we're guarding those squares. We're also threatening a fork just then a minute ago, weren't we? Knight back to e6. Oh yeah, this is the point, sorry, where we've got to be careful. Knight g6 is okay here, but as black, you actually better off. The best plan is to force the white pawn up the board, because at the moment, and we'll see it in one of the variations in a minute, if you don't keep forcing the pawn all the way up the board, white's plan is to come and provide help for the pawn getting their king round the back. But if you force the white pawn up the board, then there's just no space, and it's just sort of an impenetrable fortress. So attack the pawn, it's got to move, king back to f6. Okay. I see rook g4, and then repeat. Okay. Knight f5, king c5, and repeat. Pawn up the board, king f7. There's just no way for white to get in there. There's just no way for the king to get in. There is no space around the back anymore. The white rook's tied down to defending the g7 pawn. It's just drawn. We can just keep moving the knight back and forth between a square and g8. But back in this position, having forced the white pawn up to g6, I mean, I said back here that knight g6 is actually okay there. Okay, we don't have to immediately, for some reason, which I haven't explored in depth, but we don't have to immediately force the white pawn up the board. There's still time to sort it out later with knight g6. But if you sort of go for this plan of forcing the white pawn up the board, so you've sort of, half got on with it. Here, you would lose with other moves. Knight h6 is okay, but if we sort of just abandon that plan a little bit and just go knight g7, this time you've lost. The king's in, knight f5, king d7, and there's just enough space round the back. It was important back here. I mean, that knight h6 apparently is also a draw move, but it was important to, or it was easiest, if you like, to just keep forcing that pawn up the board and get to that sort of completely impenetrable fortress. Or if black went king g7, it's lost as well. King c6, knight e7 check. Oh yeah, this is back to the you won the pawn, but you've done so in unfavourable circumstances. King d6, knight takes g6, king to e6, and yeah, you're in trouble there as black. I mean, the king's got to stay in contact with the knight, and then the next move would be king f6. That's checkmate in 11 apparently. That's checkmate in just 7. So the knight's going to get 1. I think we've already seen this position actually, haven't we? In one of the other lines. I think that's everything on those positions. So I guess the summary from all of that is, if you've got good knowledge of rook versus knight, and again I just think that's hard, but it's keep your knight out of the corner, don't let your knight get separated from the king, then yeah, you've usually use that knowledge in thinking about if some pawns that remain on the board, like this position, the player with the white pieces just knew that if they get swapped, it's fine, and I'm still going to win that because the black king's in the corner, or the knight's in the corner, or the knight's got separated from the king. This was a very interesting position where white could set up a fortress around this pawn, and this ended up with the same thing. There was a win here for white that wasn't really connected with what we're talking about, but what was connected with what we're talking about is exploring what happens if one of those pawns goes. So we explored that line, and we explored this line, okay. And that's basically the same thing. That I thought it was quite interesting. You definitely have to think schematically of, like, the only way that white can make progress is to get their king round the back of their rook. Black can't actively go after the g pawn if white does nothing, but they can wait for the white king to disappear behind the rook, and then they have to actively go after the g pawn, or the white king's going to connect, and they're going to lose the game. Anyway, I think I've waffled on for long enough. Hope everybody found those ideas interesting.